Welcome to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamwork's Intelligence. In every episode, we bring you insights into the teams behind the teams in professional football. Coming up on today's episode.
Now, defenses are getting more attuned to how to defend it, more man-to-man marking, much more physical. Physical levels are going higher and higher. So this way of playing is running into a bit of a problem because its inherent predictability is being countered, but then where does it go?
I'm Simon Austin from Training Ground Guru, and our guest on this episode is Jamie Hamilton. Jamie is a UEFA A-licensed coach and has become one of the foremost thinkers in football. His writing about positionism and relationism has struck a chord with fans, players and coaches, all the way from grassroots through to elite, and is leading a change in the game. We hope you enjoy this podcast, and if you do, please give us a follow via your preferred podcast provider. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, Jamie.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I first got to know you reading a few of your articles, and they really encapsulated a lot of the things I'd been thinking, but maybe hadn't been able to put together as well as you had. So just to start with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, please? What you do, where you are?
Sure, yeah. Well, like many listeners, I'm sure, to this podcast, and people who are familiar with Training Ground Guru, I'm a football coach. I wasn't always a football coach. I actually came into it a little bit later in life. But yeah, my story is probably familiar to a lot of people. I start volunteering at the local club, go through various environments of youth football or senior football, semi-professional football, professional football. And then, most recently, I was in the Slovenian Premier League for a very short period. Unfortunately, due to some uncontrollable aspects of the financial side of football, which sometimes happens for these in these situations. But fantastic experience, and looking forward to what the next challenge is going to be. That's the coaching side of it. I'm also in tandem with that development of the practical side of coaching. I've always been very interested in the theoretical and where tactical theory, coaching theory, where they intersect, how these kinds of debates, discussions, concepts, how they actually translate into what we do on the field. So I suppose in some sense, as part of my own development and just through my own interest and curiosity, I've written a lot about various aspects of football, and sometimes a little bit broader, tying in more maybe cultural or aesthetic ideas like art, music, film, into how I see the game and putting them online. So it's good to get real-time feedback. And yeah, over the maybe past few years, I've been concentrating on a concept which I have called relationism. It contains ideas that, of course, are not mine. It's not something I invent, but I coined the term. And yeah, this has had a significant impact on, let's say, the coaching domain and the discourse around it and the tactical theory that feeds into it. And it's been very interesting, exciting to follow those threads and see which unexpected places they take us.
Yeah, and as I said at the start, I think you really have struck a chord with people ranging from fans, who's got grassroots players, all the way through to professional managers and players, which we'll get into more in this podcast. But could you just tell us then a little bit about positionalism and how you became interested in this concept to start with?
Well, again, I think many coaches, if not all, will be familiar by now with the concept of positional play. I give it a little shorthand, positionism, just to give it a kind of a broader governing concept about maybe the more philosophical assumptions that go into that style of play. But, broadly speaking, I think Guardiola's impact on the global game, 2008, Barcelona, through to 2011, that final against Manchester United at Wembley. Some of the play of that team, I think, was really otherworldly. Arguably the greatest club side of all time. I think that's reasonable to make that case. And that had a huge impact on me. I became very interested in the ideas surrounding it. Of course, at the same time, you have this kind of explosion of online content. 2009, 2010, social media platforms are becoming very active. Smartphones are in people's pockets. So the spread of information is very different to how it had been before. And that was certainly amplified in terms of the coaching discourse. Platforms like Twitter became a real hub, right, for this new form of analysis. And through those things and my own practical observations, I became very interested in positional play. I tried to coach my own versions of positional play to some degree of success, right? The play was effective, and I was always interested in controlling or having teams control the ball and control possession and be calm with the ball. I always liked that approach to football. And it seemed to me that the way to do that was to follow some of these, or if not all of these rules, right? Or at least my own interpretation of these rules of where players have to be in certain moments, how the pitch should be occupied, some of the patterns of play that develop from that, some of the concepts that are involved. And I've became, let's say, very engrossed in that methodology and that philosophy. And it was, I think, very useful to do that.
So at the heart of positionalism and Guardiola's philosophy is ball possession then, and controlling the ball and controlling the play.
Sure. But I think what's interesting is that while that's, I think, broadly understood across media, across coaching, across just the average fan, I think what's more interesting and the area that I'm specifically interested in, it's a particular type of possession. And there's a particular way in which that possession is facilitated and enabled. And in Guardiola's case, and in the school of positional play, or juego de posición, the Spanish name, and it has roots, of course, going back through Holland and even further, if you want to trace it. The very general concept is that players occupy certain sectors of the field, and in Guardiola's own words, the players don't move, the ball moves to the players. Now, that's, of course, an exaggeration, but it's very telling that Guardiola himself would phrase it in such a way. So we can see that very clearly in the possession structures, right? That have become so ubiquitous with possession football. You can just look at almost any analysis of the last maybe decade or so now, and immediately the analysis will look at the in possession phase, and it'll detail, okay, what, 3-2-5, whatever, 2-3-5, some kind of numerical delineation of where the players are positioned on the pitch. And that positioning, that rational occupation of space, allows combinations and relationships to develop within that structure. It might also just be worth saying, and not to go into some kind of broad tactical history, probably don't have time for that, although it's an interesting discussion. And this is something, I have a podcast as well, the Third Circle podcast, where we get right into these kind of things. So if people want to check that out, I do that with Martin and Raphael. This positional game is emerging somewhat in response to positional defending. We would call that zonal defending. So the Saki revolution of the late 80s, early 90s, filtering through the global game. Defense is organized in zonal structures, but of course, defending in zonal structures means that you leave space between the lines. And positional play is very concerned with positioning its attacking players between those lines, in pockets, becoming free men, using the team as almost a network of pinning players to stretch out the opponent, open the spaces between those lines, put players in there, and then find those free men with passes through the lines. So that's, I think, very broadly how perhaps Guardiola is approaching this, or has been approaching it.
I'm a big admirer of a rugby coach called Brian Ashton, and he uses I think it's an army term, VUCA, volatile, uncertain. I'm trying to remember the other term actually. But basically said that the game, you can't predict what's going to happen. It's very volatile, as we say. Do you think Guardiola, that he's trying to make it a very, very certain game and predictable and control what happens?
Yeah, and I think that's a natural thing to do. I actually think that's been happening since the dawn of football. Again, people might be familiar with Jonathan Wilson's book, Inverting the Pyramid, which I suppose would be like the canonical English language account of tactical history. And the very first opening lines or opening paragraph of Inverting the Pyramid, I'll paraphrase it, I probably can't do it exactly, but it's, in the beginning, there was chaos. And the process of tactical thought and coaching theory has been a march towards instantiation of order, certainty, onto that chaos to try and make the game more organized, more understandable, more clear. And that movement from chaos to order has come in many different guises and phases. Could be defensive, could be attacking, many different ways. But yeah, Guardiola again, and many coaches like Guardiola or that follow this school of thought, are quite explicit when they talk about chaos being a kind of negative thing. So this is a very important distinction to understand from this more positional mindset or philosophical attitude, is that chaos, uncertainty, radical volatility, they are inherently negative in their quality. So we want to try and have less of that and more of the order that we have familiarity with. And that can then help us and the players to know where they are, to orient themselves, and then to execute certain actions within those understandings very quickly and efficiently. So yeah, this is a very important distinction. Relationism, which I would say have a more of a natural tendency towards, just even on a human level. And I think that's probably why it's resonated with a lot of people, although there are obviously game theory reasons too. I tend to have a proclivity towards a little bit more chaos, right? I don't necessarily see that as inherently negative. Of course it can be, it can lead to incoherence and things falling apart and all the rest of it. But it's also very important that systems have an aspect of chaos within them to allow new things to emerge. Because if things become too static and too ordered, we get a very stagnant, let's say, landscape, which doesn't really help the emergence of new things. So yeah, this concept of chaos and order, very interesting for this.
So you were saying that as a coach, you became very, very interested in these principles and you tried to work them into what you were doing and how you were coaching. Did you reach a point then where you started to question this approach?
The positional method?
The positional method, yeah, where you questioned it and doubted it a little bit and then challenged it?
Yeah, well, I suppose that always, because I as a person, in my own being, have more of a tendency, let's say, towards the more chaotic side. I'm very interested in certain music, certain art. And there was always that tension within me that while I was coaching this more ordered positional method, it felt a little bit, off, right? Something wasn't quite right. But I reconciled that within myself by just accepting that if I wanted the team to play possession, controlling football, to make many passes and have this kind of ball possession game, I just had to do that, because I wasn't aware of any other possibility. It seemed that was the only way forward if possession football was going to be achieved. So there was always that tension. And of course, as I've mentioned, I was interested in coaching theory, tactical theory. So areas like ecological dynamics, constraints-based coaching, the work of people like Mark O'Sullivan, right, Keith Davids, that always seemed to me to have a tension with this more ordered positional play. And as I was coaching the positional style, and I don't say I coached it even well or, whatever, the best ever, not at all. But in my own interpretation of it, I found myself having to be very restrictive with the players and saying, hey, no, you have to be there. What are you doing? You can't just go in there. If you're the left winger, I want you on the left in this situation. If you go in, the other guy has to be organized. The other guy has to go out. You can't just do this kind of mazy thing that you're doing. So anyway, yeah, there was this tension. And I suppose it wasn't until I saw the football of Brazilian coach Fernando Diniz and his Fluminense team, who people might be familiar with. That was in 2022. Around summer 2022, I first saw some of the video of those games. And, I've made somewhat of a big deal about that team and that coach. But the reason for that is not because I think every team should play like that or it's some kind of, solution to all our problems. I just found it very, very interesting and instructive that this team was playing possession football, high possession stats, lots of passes, lots of control of the ball, but achieved in a very, very different way to the familiar Guardiolan positional play methods. So yeah, that was the kind of, I suppose, light bulb moment going off there.
Yeah, fascinating. So would you say that the Guardiola positional style has become kind of the dominant style in English football now? Not only in the Premier League, but further down as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last decade or so, since Guardiola's rise, it's become really the dominant paradigm in global football. Not that there's not always been difference. I mean, there always, Mourinho was there at the start, and Simeone, and then Klopp has many different. Like, there are different interpretations. But I think as we've gone on, I think what we've seen, is a real homogenization among not only top level coaches like in the English Premier League, although we can get to what's happening now, which is quite interesting. But certainly over the last decade or so, of coaches that are, I mean, we'll just look at Arteta, Maresca. These guys work with Guardiola, right? And they're now in charge of the top teams. And I think, again, many youth coaches, academy coaches will be listening to this, and I'm sure they'll be familiar with these kinds of principles at very young age groups now, right? The ideas of, occupying half spaces and inverting fullbacks and all these kinds of things. Not that there's nothing evil about all that stuff, but it has become the dominant paradigm. And when something or a concept or an ideology becomes so widespread and dominant, it becomes difficult to see alternatives. It becomes difficult to see outside of that. And I think, unfortunately, that seems to be what's happened in a large number of cases. Not that that's Guardiola's fault in any way. He's essentially a football genius who is arguably the most influential and certainly one of the most successful coaches of all time. But the problem seems to be the blind following of Guardiola's methods in ways that are not as good as his, right? It's almost like people think they can copy paste and be Pep Guardiola just by, reading some tactical guidelines and downloading some positional play exercises. And sure, a lot of the time the team kind of looks the same, and some people are very good at it as well. There's no doubt. But a lot of the time we get the kind of positional structure, these positional principles, certainly without the kind of, I would call, more player-led, spontaneous magic of certainly that Barcelona team, Messi, Iniesta, Xavi. And just one thing on that, I think it's interesting that what happened with that Barcelona team is that, of course, Guardiola is important, but I mean, those players are generational, and having them together caused insane things to emerge. But what seems to have happened is that people have just taken the coaching side of that team and said, oh, well, if I want to play like Barcelona, I just have to do what Guardiola did. Well, no, to play like Barcelona, you're going to need some pretty good players, right, to help out with that structure. Yeah. So it seems to be a little bit more, the tactics is only the system, this kind of definable diagram stuff, the 2D bird's eye view on the board. That's football tactics. The rest is, just some player magic. We can't really do much about that. We're coaches. We should be designing systems, drawing the diagrams. And I think that's where we are. I mean, if you look at just the majority of analysis, you'll see this approach, right?
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that, actually, because you were saying how much you admired that Barcelona team, one of the greatest teams of all time. Did you get a little bit bored then and stale with the style as it then went on to, say, Bayern and then Man City? Or has it changed a little bit over that time? Or was it those players at that time that particularly elevated it?
I think a little bit of both, right? I think, as I said, that Barcelona team seems to be something of a perfect storm, right? Some kind of generational moment, which you can't really replicate. In terms of Guardiola's trajectory, I think Bayern was interesting, right? I mean, he didn't play the same way, and he realized that pretty quickly, that he didn't have the same players. And Guardiola, of course, adapts. I mean, it's well known he's an adaptable coach. But, I think that something that's emphasized less is that he adapts within a positional paradigm, within the positional structures. So his Bayern team would be different, maybe more overloads in the center, but still a positional game, right? Even at Barcelona, okay, Zlatan's probably a little bit of a easy example to use, being such a maverick, but he certainly didn't appreciate being told where to stand, right, by Guardiola. And there's comments about that. Ribéry at Bayern Munich took much of the same attitude. I've come my whole life from whatever background I've come from, I've done it by being Frank Ribéry. I don't need someone to tell me now. So there were always these tensions there. Early Manchester City, but again, animated by they had players Sané, Jesus, Sterling, Silva. A lot of the time, very interesting attacking combinations there, but still positional structures. But in the last 5-6 years, maybe, I think there's been a real shift. I think the treble-winning team was pretty conservative, right? A lot of defenders on that team, very structured play. You had Haaland and ability to go more direct. So I think, that as we've gone on, this tendency towards control and certainty and order seems to have intensified, right? Where we get to the point where I find today in a league like the Premier League, although the players are fantastic, unbelievable players, and there's talented coaches, I'm not trying to denigrate or attack people, But I do find much of the play somewhat formulaic and less, certainly in the attacking phase, right, and less inspiring than I think what could be possible or achievable with those players. Who am I to start dishing out, lessons to these top coaches? But just from an onlooker's point of view, I think it's, I think it's valid to express one's feelings about these things.
Definitely. No, I think a lot of people would concur with you there. And there's so much to go into, really, which I think we will. I suppose you've got number one kind of the, I don't know if you call it the moral issue, really, about how you deal with people and how much freedom you give them. Then you've got the entertainment aspect, as you say. And then there's pragmatism, which I was just going to ask a little bit about now. It seems to me that a lot of coaches follow Guardiola, but he's always been in a position where he's had the budget to buy exactly the players he needs to implement this style, which not many managers have that luxury, really, which then makes it not a very pragmatic approach, as you say, if you don't have the players who can do this positional style.
Well, yeah, and I think this taps into a very interesting and I think relevant topic at the moment about coaches having some kind of pre-designed, whether it's a formation or at least system, which they might tweak a little bit, but often it is a formation. And 3-2-5, 2-3-5 is probably the most common in possession of coaches having this idea already in their head. So they arrive at a team or an age group in an academy or whatever, and their first thought is, okay, which player's going to go in which slot? And as you say, like, what if you don't have players who are particularly suited to this arrangement on the pitch and these qualities and roles that are required in this system? Of course, if you're Guardiola, you buy the ones that can. Okay, that's top level football. That's what happens. Do I think that's a really good way for people to think about football coaching? Not necessarily, because it really casts players as commodities that are just traded and sold until you get the right ones that fit the slot of your system, which is a reality of modern football. And okay, we can accept that. But is that the way that you should think about football as a coach? I think not necessarily, right? So more appealing to me, and I think a central tenet of relational football, is for the coach to arrive in whichever context they are and evaluate, who do I have? Like, who are these people? Who are these people? Who are these players? What are their qualities? And how can I, as a coach, help design or grow or develop, whatever word you want to use, a system, and it's still a system, but a system that maximizes or allows these players to show the best of themselves. So if you have two strikers who play really well together in training, why wouldn't you play a system with two strikers? The more you think about this, the more crazy it seems that you would actually not do this. And there was Gary Kernan, who has the Modern Soccer Coach podcast, recently was in Brazil. And if you've been following his interviews, they're interesting. He was talking to one of the development coordinators at Fluminense. So back to Fluminense, interesting parallel. And yeah, there was anecdotes coming from that academy of very successful coach development that takes the approach of saying, well, we don't have a 4-3-3 all the way through the academy. We don't have some kind of game model, standardized game model curriculum that everyone must follow to maximize familiarity. We don't do that. What we do is look at the players, and we can play completely different formations and different systems in each age group. But that is a result of the players and how they fit together, how they complement each other, and how those connections or relations can actually maximize the effectiveness. One just maybe metaphor to highlight this. It's almost like if you're making furniture and it's for mass consumption and you have to make a table for IKEA or whatever, you have a blueprint of what that table is, and you're just going to follow that design. And whatever materials it is you're using, you're just going to make that same thing every single time. Whereas a more, let's say, artisanal or creative approach to table making would be to look at the, let's say, the wood or the materials you have and say, okay, well, what is this wood? And what kind of table could this wood be? Like, what can maximize the qualities of this material that I have? And you could say it about food, a restaurant owner who wants to make seasonal, what ingredients do I have? I don't just want to follow recipes and produce, fast food, standardized burgers. I want to look at what are the ingredients, what are the qualities specific to this place, to this area, to this season? And then how can I put them together in such a way that those ingredients shine and show the best of themselves in the context of a coherent collection? So Yeah, Mateus Mana, someone I admire a lot, the coach of the Argentinian national team, one of the assistant coaches, put it very well and clearly when he said, the art of coaching is the arrangement of players. I really like that. It's very simple, and I think it touches on what we've been talking about. But yeah, having these prefabricated ideas of structure and then seeing players as items which you fit into the cogs can work, can be extremely effective. But I think the ceiling on that type of coaching is lower than the type of, let's say, more relational arrangements that coaches could take responsibility for helping to create.
I have heard quite a few examples of this happening, actually, as I'm sure you have. So, for instance, Ange Postecoglou at Tottenham told the wingers they had to stay very wide, hug the touchline. The fullbacks would go inside. So apparently then you see kind of the life drop out of Heung-min Son because he cuts inside and has that bending shot where he's scored a lot of goals. You know, it's a huge part of his game. He's not able to do that anymore. Then Pedro Porro, who's very good at crossing, he's coming inside into that half space, you know. And then we saw it at Forest with the high line, but defenders who don't have much pace and were used to defending the low block. And I mean, I'm not a football coach, so who should I be to tell Ange Postecoglou what to do? But that seems crazy, you know, and it doesn't seem to be making the best use of the players that you have.
I think that's the concern. And you touched on an interesting, and I've said it as well already in this conversation, who am I to criticize it? I do think that sometimes in football, there's a real sensitivity to criticism of like top coaches, where it's almost like the beyond reproach. If you think of other domains like politics, for example, no one thinks twice about seriously criticizing people who are in positions of power and influence. And I don't think that should be different necessarily. Just because you criticize a top coach, you get sometimes hit back with, oh yeah, who are you? You don't know anything about this. And what have you won? Blah, blah. It's like, yeah, fine. Like, I'm not saying the guy's not successful. He clearly is. But it doesn't mean that legitimate criticisms can't be made. And I think what you've described is absolutely legitimate. If you're Pedro Porro, who's a very good outside fullback and delivers fantastic crosses, and that's your game, right? And you're a player who really has made a fantastic career and looking to develop further by doing those kinds of things. Not that you can't diversify, of course you can, but being asked to go and play as a half-space interior, that's a very different game, right? Especially at the highest level imaginable. And yeah, it seems counterintuitive to try and force players into these slots that have their own roles. It also has huge impact on how you assess a player's quality, because then it might be, oh, well, this player can't go inside this fullback. Like, he's not right for me. He's not good enough fullback because he's not versatile enough. It's like, well, you know, if it's an outside fullback, Colombia, a national team who I really enjoy watching and have been fantastic over the last few years, Nesta Lorenzo, the coach, as two, Mujica Munoz, the fullbacks are outside guys, right? They're physical, powerful fullbacks, and they go on the outside, and they go hard, and they put balls in the box, and it's effective. They're not drifting into the middle to make little receive on the back foot and get their chest out and make these half-space actions like Florian Wirtz or something. They're different. So players are different. So let's appreciate their differences and find ways that those differences can be amplified, and that when we put those differences together, actually new things can happen rather than the same patterns that we've seen before and the same patterns that we're so desperate for our teams to replicate.
Yeah. I heard one other story, which I'll just share just to show that this is a real issue. It was a player at a championship club. There'd been a change of manager over the summer. He played a pass that then was intercepted, led to a goal. And the manager afterwards said to him, why didn't you play the obvious pass there? And he said, I'm not allowed to play that pass. The previous manager told me I can't play that pass, which again seems crazy, doesn't it? Where people aren't allowed to play in the moment and they have these preordained rules.
Yeah, this is the thing. Again, this gets very muddled, right? Because we can make this criticism of saying, why are you giving these players instructions? Why are you giving the player these rules? I agree. I tend to agree with you. But then it'll be like, oh, well, in all football is just constraints. In all football is constrained in some way. If Fernando Diniz's team is coming over to the side, it's because he's told them to come over to the side. It's just a different way of doing things. And there's some truth in that. But I think what's important is the nature of the constraints that as a coach you're placing on your team, right? Because coaching is constraints. Like whatever way you want to shape it, as a coach, otherwise, what are you doing? You can just retire, right? We don't need coaches. Players can do it themselves. That doesn't seem to be effective at this point in time. I don't want to talk myself and others out of job here, right? So yeah, the coach seems to be a relevant part of this process. So, but then what are you doing when you're putting these constraints on? What are the constraints? And telling a player, never do this or never do that, yeah, it can be dangerous, because perhaps it's better to try and facilitate the team into situations where the players become comfortable in making their own kinds of choices, right? And making the players feel at ease with trusting their own intuitions about the game to make actions. Not to say that, of course, if something's going wrong and there's repeated mistakes, you aren't going to coach and analyze and use video and help the player. But is it helping by giving these strict rules of what you can and can't do? Or is it trying to align the players' perceptions with those of their teammates, right? In the moment, who is around me? What kind of player is the teammate near me? Are they fast? Are they slow? Are they left-footed? Are they right-footed? Do they like a ball on the ground? Can they take a ball in the air? And those kinds of immediate environmental factors being the primary constraints that are shaping the behavior and intentions of the players. So it's more of a bottom-up environmental set of constraints than kind of top-down.
Yeah. So in the heart of this positional philosophy, is it the coach making themselves more important than the players, basically?
I mean, again, to be somewhat delicate with this, I'm not trying to say that every coach that does that wants to be, some kind of like dictator of the team, right? I mean, I didn't feel that when I was coaching positional play. I believed that what I was doing was helping the players and helping to make attractive, attacking, effective football, right? But I think just via the consequence of the assumptions of this approach, which we've been talking about, it does put the coach at that kind of position, right? Of this more of a top-down controller. Not that it's all top-down, not that every single action is pre-programmed. Of course, players are deciding things. But in the positional game, which we're talking about specifically, it's important to understand the kind of freedom, in quotations, that the players are allowed. And again, let's go to a coach to explain it, Enzo Maresca, who was asked directly about this in a very recent interview with Sky Sports. The question was about the tension between positional play and freedom of players. Very pertinent issue, as we're discussing right now. And Maresca addressed it. He said, no, there is no tension for me. This is complete misinterpretation, because the players, he said, I give the players freedom, right? Through, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, through positioning them in pockets of space between lines. Let's use Cole Palmer for an example. So for Maresca, and in the positional paradigm, the concept of freedom is to do with a player receiving the ball without pressure and with time to receive it. So that's the freedom, right? So by the right winger pinning the opposite fullback, by other pinnings happening, by other positional dynamics, Cole Palmer is afforded a pocket of space, which if he's doing what he should do in this paradigm, he moves into. So he is now, let's say, between four different players who are all pinned by different other ones. So he is free. So for Maresca, this system has given Palmer freedom. And now Palmer can receive the ball and he has more time and space to express himself, right? This is the logic. Of course, it's not about curtailing freedom. I'm giving Palmer the freedom and then he can go to express himself. But that's, of course, a very different concept of freedom from a coach like Carlo Ancelotti, let's say, who, when he's asked about how he's going to arrange his forward line, he says, like, well, sometimes Rodrigo's on the right, but then I see him on the left of the pitch. And I think, well, what's he doing over there? But that could be nice, So Rodrigo would be, or Vinicius or whoever, Benzema, are allowed to move anywhere, usually towards the ball because they're footballers and they want to play with the ball. And what you end up is with these kind of overload situations, and they make 1-2s and flicks and close combination tricks, which, I like a lot, but, that's a little bit beside this point. But the freedom in Ancelotti's definition is different to the freedom of the positional Maresca version. And again, that's why these conversations get a little bit lost sometimes, because if we say, oh, well, you're curtailing the player's freedom, the answer is no, I'm not. I'm giving the player freedom. But what we need to understand is the difference between these concepts of coaching. And the positional paradigm sees freedom in one way. Is that the only way to see freedom? Clearly not. So why not let's have a coaching landscape where we can appreciate different understandings of these terms, and, we can play against each other and we can see, what happens. I know which definition or which concept I prefer. I prefer it to be more player-led, more intuitive, more of the player making that decision to whether to go to the ball, whether to stay, basing those decisions on what is happening in the game. Who am I playing with? Where are the opponents playing? What are the qualities of my teammates? All these kinds of things, rather than What was the plan on the board before the game? What was the system laid out in training? There's huge benefits to this familiarity, this positional game. But I would prefer systems which the player's ability to intuit and read emergent game, real phenomena as the primary set of constraints on their actions. For me, that's very key. And I think that, as I've said, I think the potential of coaching like that is higher if it can be done well than the prefabricated mode. And the reason I say that, because that could sound a little bit like I'm just plucking that out the air. Well, why do you think that's more effective? This positional style, let's say broadly speaking, because it's based on more definable actions and more pre-established movements and structures, the key to success is the efficiency with which the actions are executed with, right? The speed and quality. So it's like, do it faster and do it better, because it's quite predictable. Because when you play against, let's say, Maresca's Chelsea, you know pretty much what formation they're going to use, what they're going to do. But it's still very hard to stop them because the players are very good at doing these things, doing these actions. So even when you know about it, it becomes difficult because they're so good at it. Now, defenses are getting more attuned to how to defend it, more man-to-man marking, we can get to it, much more physical. Physical levels are going higher and higher. So this way of playing is running into a bit of a problem because its inherent predictability is being countered. But then where does it go? It can't go faster than the human limit of being fast, right? Because these are human beings. It's not like an industry factory where you can, if they're not fast enough or good enough, you replace them with machines. In a football team, there's a human biological limit to how fast and how efficient you can be. So once you hit that limit, which I would say we're approaching, where do you go? And for me, that's where these more relational, socio-affective, communicative understandings of the emergent environment will come into play.
Teamwork's intelligence gives clubs an edge that can enable smarter decisions faster. When most teams are drowning in data and not getting nearly enough out of it, Teamwork's intelligence can clear the way. Built by a powerhouse team of sports data scientists, engineers, and football data experts who have been shaping this industry for over a decade, we understand the challenges teams face. With data now at the forefront of scouting, recruitment, and team analysis, Teamwork's Intelligence has built a platform that turns billions of data points into precise models, predictive metrics, and insights that actually make a difference to a club's performance, both on and off the field. Ready to level up? Head to teamworks.com to learn more.
We hear a lot of fans saying that we don't see the maverick talents anymore, the off the cuff. So I'm thinking, Ryan Giggs running from his own half against Arsenal, Paul Gascoigne, some of the things he'd do, Glenn Hoddle. And then Jonathan Northcroft wrote a very good article in the Sunday Times where he mentioned you. And he was talking about Eze, saying that his heat map now looks like an L shape, a bit like Grealish's did at Manchester City because they're constrained. These great talents. So do you think that is a fair point, that we're not seeing those maverick off-the-cuff talents as much as we did?
I think there's truth to it. It's not that we don't see great talents. I mean, we've got, Yamil Lamal and Pedri in Barcelona, and there's, various players who are still fantastic. But yeah, the nature of the actions and the nature of the behaviors, I think, is somewhat different, right, on a general scale. And take Grealish, for example. It's an easy one to use, but I think it is relevant that he would be your kind of quintessential maverick, right? You mentioned Gascoigne, and kind of Grealish is that kind of Gascoigne-esque English baller, right? Socks around the ankles and just kind of barreling his way through tackles and drifting past players with dribbles and all the rest of it. That's what made Jack Grealish Jack Grealish. That's what made him worth, I don't know, how much did they sign him for? Like 100 million or something like that?
Yeah.
So he became a 100 million rated player by being authentically Jack Grealish, right? He was just doing Grealish stuff. But then he went to a playing system, a playing environment that was very different. And as we've talked already about the constraints, it wasn't now that Grealish, and he's said this explicitly, right, about Dean Smith and now David Moyes. They say to Jack Grealish, Jack, do what you want, go where you want in possession, go and get the ball. Like, if you want to stay left for a while, stay left for a while, no problem. But like, you can go and get the ball and influence the game. And he says, I like that because that allows me to interpret the game how I want. In Manchester City, of course it's different. There's no dressing it up. And it doesn't have to be, oh, that's evil and that's great. You can have make up your own mind about that. But to be unaware of this hugely significant and I would say starkly obvious difference seems crazy to me in coaching discourse. Like, Grealish is being told, stay there, unless this happens, then you move in there, then you move in there. Okay, you can do this and that, but it's far more constrained positionally, spatially, where you can be at certain moments of the game. You must be far from the ball a lot of the time because you're pinning and you're allowing these pockets. Like, it's a different way of understanding the game of football. And the more that coaches coach like that, of course, the actions of these players are then constrained, right? So you would see them more receiving in the pocket, turning, making these very efficient, clean executions of pre-understood actions. And by the way, positional play is also very concerned with the body of the players, right? The posture of the players, almost to like a kind of balletic level, right? Where a player's posture is being coached as they receive the ball and turn the hips. This is a very important thing to understand as well. And this is trained from young ages. I mean, people in Spain and coaches would talk explicitly about this as being one of the strengths, right? So you tend to get these actions almost looking similar. You know, there he is in the pocket, half space turn, thread the through ball, go. Really effective, do it. But that, of course, is different to, let's say, a Gascoigne or classic Grealish, you know, going, picking the ball up, playing a 1-2, dribbling 3 guys and doing whatever. It's a very different style. So I think when people say there's a lack of a maverick, I think that's probably the more tactical explanation for what's happening. Yeah. What will happen with guys like Eze? I'm very interested, actually, right now, Simon, about guys like Eze at Arsenal, guys like Cherki at Manchester City, because I think there is a realization, as I've mentioned, that some of this more static and pre-planned positional games are becoming negated by very aggressive man-to-man pressing systems. So is this maverick role going to creep back in? Are we going to see guys like Cherki and Eze afforded more autonomy to make spontaneous creative actions? I hope so. Will it happen with these coaches? I think that's a really interesting way to watch how this Premier League unfolds.
Yeah. Is it linked with out of possession as well? So if you tell a Grealish he can go where he wants, then he's then out of position if you lose the ball and you're vulnerable then?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. This is a really important question. And in my experience of coaching practically and working with other coaches, and also in more of a consultancy role, talking about these ideas with other with clubs around Europe, that is the question that comes up all the time and probably the most pertinent question. All very nice, Jamie. This sounds great. We all want to have this flurry of combinations and players expressing themselves. What are we going to do when we lose the ball? Because these teams we play against now kill you, right? They will destroy you on these counterattacks in 6-7 seconds. The ball's in the net. So how does this work? I think there's a few different ways to look at it, right? What we're talking about really in this case is rest defense, which is this concept of while the attacking players are making their attacks, what is the rest of the team doing, right? What's the defensive midfielder, the centre-backs, how are they positioned to try and stop any kind of potential counter-attack happening? And that's why you often see like a rest defence in a 3-2 or let's say a 2-3 regimented structure, so that there's maybe 5 attacking players engaged in trying to break the back line, but at the same time, there's maybe 5 or sometimes 4, if you're really risky, 3 players, but they've got their set positions and they're making sure that they're on duty to guard a counter-attack. So that's a more, again, kind of positional, structured approach to this concept of rest defense. You can look at rest defense from another perspective, something that maybe Red Bull were interested in, and still are to a large degree, that when you play, let's say, more relational football where players are more free to move around, you will get these clusters of players, let's say on the side of the pitch often, and that's become something of a trademark of a more relational style. Players gathered together, making short combinations. And of course, that will lead to spaces being open, but it also gives you more players, higher density of players in the immediate proximity of the ball when it's lost. So counter-pressing then becomes a very important strategy to mitigate against counter-attacks in this style. So rather than a regimented 3-2 structured rest defense, more of an emphasis, Red Bull style, you might say, although I would say they overcook their entire model into just counter-pressing. An emphasis on counter-pressing becomes very important. But it's also not to say that general rest defense principles are not positional in nature. They're just principles of football in general, right? And this is something else. I find it. I'll come back to the defending, but there's this feeling that sometimes I get that coaches who have a positional mindset think that if they don't prescribe the positions, the players are just going to do like really stupid things and like move into like crazy positions. And it's like, well, they're actually very good footballers, right? And it's not as if if you don't particularly describe where they have to be, that they're suddenly just going to abandon everything they've learned about the game and start running all over the place, right? And that's sometimes a criticism that I think is a little bit off. Same in a more relational game with a less structured positional arrangement in possession. You know, if you're a defensive midfielder or the opposite fullback, you're still going to be aware of what's happening. Okay, the players are in a bit of a cluster on the left. They're engaging in some kind of combination. Okay, this kind of play is a little bit risky. Like if they get out of there, if we can't counterpress, if we can't tactical foul, I need to be ready. So it's not that the players, just because they play in a relational style, completely forget about this kind of duty, right? It's like they're still aware. And these are the kinds of things that you would coach. It's different, of course. You could say it's a more relational approach to rest defense rather than a positional structured approach to rest defense. But it's also not as if positional teams haven't been affected on counterattacks. I mean, it happens every week. So an interesting one. I see the concern, and I think it's probably one of the areas that can be developed most in terms of creative coaching and developing new concepts. But yeah, relational approach to rest defense, theoretically and practically, very clear how it works. Implementation shouldn't be inherently more disadvantaged than the positional approach.
Yeah. And I read your newsletter that came out this morning, or your article that came out shortly before we got on this podcast. Could you just tell us a bit, please, then, about how teams have negated this positional style, why it's not as effective as it was, as you touched on, and then also what we're seeing now, where it, a lot of long throws, set pieces, dominant, etc.
Yeah, and this has obviously been a very dominant narrative around. There's a couple of caveats. It's a small sample size at the start of this Premier League, but I think the trends have been there for a little while longer than that. A primary reason, I think, for the problem with some of these more established positional systems, and again, from the coaches themselves, Guardiola, Slot, have talked about the rise in man-to-man marking. I talked a fair bit about positional play strengths of getting players between lines of defensive structures. Well, what happens if the defensive structure doesn't have lines? Or what happens if you don't defend in a structure, but rather defend man-to-man? Well, then you can't put a free man between lines. So the manner in which you try to move the ball forward and control it and get players turned with an ability to pass forward becomes completely different, because there is no free man. Maresca's freedom is a lot harder to find, right? Because a player will not allow themselves to be pinned. They'll just follow Palmer and stand next to him, right? So that freedom becomes harder to find, which is why I would say you find a lot of these positional structures, not all the time, they can still achieve it. Newcastle are a team that seem to defend very zonally and leave huge gaps between them. So it's not like it's completely homogenous across the league, but more and more teams, Bournemouth, for example, are implementing these man-to-man systems in pressing. So then, yeah, how do you get a player facing forward with a good situation? Seems to me there's a little bit of a lack of ideas there. Hence why, well, okay, like if they're just going to man Marcus, and it's not a silly thing to do, kick it long over the space. If they want to go man v man on the top line, get a striker like Haaland or Gyökeres or Sesko or Delap, even though the reason we're seeing these kinds of classic nines come back is precisely because of this. Well, let's just boot the ball down the pitch. Okay, that's a little bit crass, but that's essentially what's happening.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's something like, okay, stretch them out and hit the big man. He'll lay it off to guys arriving in that space to make the second ball. So you kind of open that space between the defense and the midfield line and kind of hit the striker on the halfway line. But yeah, longer balls, more direct play. And that's what you see, right? Also then, set pieces become, well, if we're going to struggle to get free players on the ball in good attacking situations, then what about attacking situations which we can plan for and choreograph, and we can come up with during the week really interesting plans. Bernardo Cueva, of course, is one of the top guys. And when we speak to Bernardo, which I've been fortunate enough to do, like there's a lot going on in throw-ins that are very interesting and might not be what people think. So I don't want to be a guy that's like, trying to criticize set piece or throw-in coaches or something like that. It's all good. But what I think is interesting is that we are going this way, right? And the reasons why. And yeah, it's for control, right? You can set up your rest defense. You have time at this, the game is freezed. It's almost like NFL, right? You make your play and you choreograph it. And as the coaches, you have control over what is happening to varying degrees. You might say, well, okay, well, what's the option? Like, what are you going to do? Just play against this man marking, this radical man marking? Well, that's why Kane at Bayern Munich is a very interesting example, right? Of saying, well, okay, well, if you're going to man Marcus, is your centre-back going to follow the centre-forward if he comes back to his own box? Is he really going to do that? He might. Gasparini's guys might do it, but against Borussia Dortmund the other night, we saw Kane like Cruyff turning on the edge of his own box to beat a player, very creative attacking player, great skills in a 1v1 situation. Why not bring those guys back and start asking defenders, asking teams real questions about, if you're going to follow us, will you follow 8 players if they drop down? Are you going to do that? If you don't, we're going to outplay you with a combination. If you do, your defense is going to look very interesting if you're going to follow us all. But I think there's a bit of a blockage, right? It's like, well, almost coaches are, oh, can we do that? It's like, yeah, you can. You can do anything within the rules of football. There's nothing in the rules of football that say anything about positions of the players, except the goalkeeper. That's the only positional constraint. That's what makes it so interesting. So that's why I would say, and I wrote that piece a little bit critical of the Premier League so far. I don't think it's a coincidence that we are seeing maybe solutions come from other leagues. I mentioned Kane at Bayern Munich, or Mjällby have just won the Swedish Premier League, very small club, who are implementing, and again, explicitly so, the coaches have talked about it, not that they're a fully relationist team, but some relational principles, right? And my critique of the Premier League there is a bit, there's so much money at stake. It's kind of a critique of the capital, influenced, ecosystem. This kind of financial adherence to financial incentives and the huge losses that can be risked. It's not a great environment for innovation because it becomes conservative. The environment becomes conservative. Sure, if something interesting emerges in another league, the Premier League, once they're sure enough that it might work, it can come to the Premier League, right? And that's what we see.
Yeah.
I mean, when was the last innovation that happened in the Premier League? Maybe I'm missing something, but we can link that, by the way, to the dearth of, okay, I'll sound too aggressive here, but no English manager has ever won the English Premier League. That's a crazy stat. And it's not that there aren't, of course, many talented English managers, but something is going on. I don't want to make it about nationality here, but there's something going on in the English Premier League there. And I think it's to do with the finances and some of the attitudes that are governing the organization of the league that do not make it a particularly, I would say, tactically interesting league. It's interesting to say, oh, it's changed and these are the changes that are happening. But in terms of if you want to look and find very innovative and creative ideas, I don't really think that the Premier League is the place to do it. Maybe to find the most innovative films, you're not going to watch Hollywood blockbusters, right? It's more of a tried and tested formula. Again, it's to do with the money involved. And I do think there's a little bit of in the tactical analysis side of the Premier League, which kind of bigs it up to be a bit more interesting than it actually is. I think that's something that maybe people can get caught up in. And again, I don't see the problem with having a more critical view of the tactical landscape of saying, well, yeah, the players are great, the coaches are, highly talented and all the rest of it's high level football and it wins. The players are so good and the environments are so dedicated to making these systems work. Of course it wins, but much of the time, but I don't think it's invalid to make these criticisms, let's say stylistically, with the view of how the limitations of the styles that are currently being used, right?
Yep.
So that's what I was getting at.
Yeah. It seems that perhaps the best teams of the future, or where the advantage could be, is the teams where the players are thinking on their feet, they're reacting in the moment, they're adapting during the game. Like the example you said about Kane, he's been man-marked, so he drags the defender right back to his own area. But that's going to scare coaches, probably, if the players are the ones making the decisions in the moment.
It scares some coaches. I think, and I mean, maybe it scares the majority of coaches. So maybe it's more of there needs to be some kind of shift in the way people are thinking about coaching, about tactics themselves. Someone who's, I think, been on your podcast, Rene Maric, gave us the line of that tactics don't exist. Well, Maric is now assistant to company at Bayern Munich, right? Interesting stuff happening. So what does Maric mean by that? Maybe he is talking about something more about players being able to intuit immediate, emergent game information. And if you're up against, if some of that information tells you that you're being man-marked as a striker and you have very good ball skills and a creative player, well, to do with that information, you can say, okay, well, Where are you going to follow me to? Let's start moving around. Again, I'll go back to Fluminense. I saw it in 2022. Ganso, people might be familiar with. One of my favorite players. He used to play with Neymar back when they were young at Santos. He had an interesting career, Ganso. Really creative Brazilian, kind of classic 10 playmaker. On occasion, when Fluminense would be up against, let's say, the high pressing of like Jorge Sampaoli's Flamengo, and their intense pressure in big games, at a goal kick, Ganso would just drop right back and stand next to the goalkeeper on the 6-yard line. The goalkeeper would roll it with his studs, and Ganso would essentially start walking out with the ball. People say, oh, what's your build-up structure? Well, that guy is the build-up structure because he's really good. Now, this might sound, again, overly simplistic, and the way I'm portraying it perhaps is, but from these kinds of principles, interesting patterns and combinations and relationships can start to happen, and players can develop a different understanding of the potentials of going through opponents, of outplaying opponents, rather than trying to find positional solutions to problems that are much less positional. As I said, the defense is not some zonal anymore, so they don't give you this spaces between the lines all the time. So why would you try and force a positional solution into a problem that isn't positional? Why not let's try to find these relational aspects, relation with the environment, relation between players, that, as I've said, to tie some of these things together, allow the capacities of players like Kane. Like, what a fantastic system that allows Harry Kane to do this. Like, that's great. And this system is surely, I don't say it's, again, they're going to win everything or anything like that, but it's interesting. And I think a really good example of coaches going, well, look, what can Kane do? Oh, this guy can actually do a lot of stuff. He's not just a guy who's going to finish. He can do many, many things. So wouldn't it be nice if we can have a system where he's allowed to show his best? And I would probably say, I think he said it himself, he showed his best later in his career, like in that game against Borussia Dortmund. Has Harry Kane ever played better than that? Maybe. I've not watched every Harry Kane game, but that surely has to be up there. Has he ever played like that? And I don't think so. Maybe not as radically different as that. So can we start to see systems where more of this stuff starts happening? Where we see, oh, why this player's over there? What are they doing over here? Oh, they're really good at playing in that area. And surprising things happen. And again, I'm making a critique that these things don't seem to be happening right now in the Premier League. I hope they will.
Yeah. And how would you define relationism or relationalism in like layman's language?
Yeah, and so to give it a very, hopefully, concise and simple way to think about relationism, and again, we're talking to coaches and people and analysts and people who are interested in this side of football, and I've already mentioned it throughout this conversation. In defensive play, we are very comfortable with the distinction between zonal defending and non-zonal defending. Non-zonal defending, we usually call man marking. That's kind of the shorthand for it. But almost every football coach, every football fan recognizes that distinction. Some more than others, but example for a corner kick, I think every single person can say, that's zonal, that's man-to-man. So that's zonal, that's non-zonal. Different way, completely different, right, ways of organizing the defense. So why, I would ask, do we have a problem in distinguishing in the attacking phase between a zonal attack, which is explicitly what Guardiola has described the positional attack as? It's a zonal game. Players are assigned to sectors of the pitch and you organize structurally. Actually, a lot of the influence came from handball, actually, if we go back to some of the roots of this. It's a zone attack. So why, again, my provocation, my question, can we not conceive or have such difficulty understanding what a non-zonal attack will look like? Now, it can't be a man-to-man attack. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't directly correlate from the defensive side. So what is a non-zonal attack? And for me, that's what I saw when I watched Fluminense, or when I watched Argentina, or when I watched Ancelotti's Real Madrid, or any number of classic teams, contemporary and through history, is that the players are achieving organization. They're playing well together and winning games and being able to be effective and functional, but in a non-zonal way. Josip Bosic, one of the, I would say, biggest influences on my work, Brazilian tactical theorist, refers to it as jogo funcional, the functional game, as opposed to the positional game. Functional, I think, has a different meaning in English. When you talk about functional football, it's almost a bit like defensive, pragmatic, or something like that. The word I prefer is relational football. So relationism is a non-zonal attacking organization.
Fantastic. And a final one, Jamie. So Fluminense, you would say, are the kind of archetypes then of this approach, and a team that people should have a look at.
I mean, they were the team in 2022 that helped me to realize this. Fernando Diniz's Fluminense, they eventually got to the World Club Cup final, some people might remember, and were comfortably beaten in the end by Guardiola's Man City. But I mean, the disparity between those teams is crazy in terms of resources. But you can enjoy some very, very fun passages of play from Fluminense as they outplay the Manchester City press in that game. Some people might have seen them. But as I've said, if you want to look for examples of this, look at Alex Ferguson's Manchester United. Look at Arsene Wenger's Arsenal. Go back if you're a history buff like me. This is another, I can go on this rant now, be in my bonnet, is that in football, I've gone through a lot of football coach education. I have the UEFA A license. I went through all these courses, right? And you go through all these courses. When do we ever talk about football history? When do we ever challenge coaches to learn, really go deep on football history? If you're a film director or music producer, probably you're going to know about the history of films, probably going to know about the history of music or art. I think in football, we tend to have a real big blind spot and we think it's some kind of like inferior stuff that is just like overly simplistic and we've moved beyond it now. We don't need to worry about it. If you go back and watch the Hungary that destroyed England at Wembley in 1953, you'll find some very interesting things. Watch the total football of Johan Cruyff. Don't just read a book about it. Watch the games. You'll see some very interesting things. Watch Colombia of 1990, or even now, watch Malmo over the last couple of years under Henrik Rydström, two-time Swedish champions. Watch Racing Santander, who currently top of the Spanish second division. I've mentioned Mjällby, who already won the Swedish Premier League. The Argentinian national team, another one. Columbus Crew under Wilfred Nancy, very interesting team. But this is what I'm getting. It's not happening in the Premier League, and people are so caught up, right, with the crash bang wallop, right, of the daily routine of the English Premier League. Football exists in other places. As coaches, I think it's very useful to go investigate across time and across space geographically, not be biased towards just watching one type of football. Watch what you want, right? I'm not telling anyone what they should or shouldn't watch, but I think it's useful as a coach to draw influences, just like in art, as a musician or a painter or a chef might do, to draw influences from a wider range of times and places as possible. And then maybe you can be in a better equipped to deal with unusual situations, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think where I'm a little bit conflicted, I liked the positional approach because I think it did lead to an increase in the technical ability of players across the league. So we suddenly see goalkeepers who are comfortable in possession, centre halves, which wasn't the case when I was growing up. You know, I've been watching football for 4 decades and I'd get very frustrated with the fullback hitting it down the channel, the goalkeeper always hitting it long, the centre halves always hitting it low. You'd have these maverick talents, but there wasn't that technical ability across the team, which I think the positional style has necessitated that there needs to be. But I've started to find it very functional and formulaic, as you say, in recent years. So that's my own kind of journey with it.
It's interesting because I think I wouldn't disagree, but I think it's also, again, like we talked about, distinguishing possession football is not just one thing. We can distinguish between certain types of possession. Guardiola, Diniz, very stark differences when they met each other, but both possession football. But even also in football technique. And I mentioned some of the things about the body posture already, but there's an interpretation of technique in positional play that is perhaps different to other interpretations of technique. So yeah, while defenders become much more confident in receiving with a profile and opening the body, and you can say this is technical improvement, and it is. It's technical improvement within a certain framework, right? Within a certain framing. Have we seen increase of, let's say, wingers making 1-2 combinations to go inside defenders, or increase in maverick central dribblers? Is that a technical thing that we've seen increase? Possibly not. I remember, was it Dembele, the Spurs midfielder? Moussa Dembele was one of my favorite players to watch because he would pick the ball up in the center of the pitch and he would just dribble guys. And you see a little bit now maybe with players like Frankie de Jong at Barcelona will hold the ball a little longer, take more touches. So we've definitely seen technical improvement, absolutely, but it's technical improvement of a certain kind. Juan Malillo, Guardiola's ex-assistant, made the famous quote about the homogenization of football and all this. He called it dos toquismo, right? 2 touchism. Receive, pass. And for sure, defenders, midfielders are much better across the board at doing this kind of stuff, keeping possession. But this is also enabled by the fact they know where their teammates are going to be, right? They're like, okay, well, if I receive here, he's going to be outside. I'm going to just do my thing, open the body, play. and I can become expert in the technical execution of that action, hugely efficient. And we've seen this huge rise. But as I mentioned in my article this morning, I think the raising of that floor has also had a counteract where it's maybe dropped the ceiling of the more maverick, intuitive, spontaneous technical actions, which I would like to see more. And that's my taste. Not everyone likes football like that. Also, you can make the argument that's not practical, Jamie. This doesn't work. I would take issue with that. I think that we can have attacking football that sees a lot more spontaneous, close proximity, deceptive, trickery, combination, dribbling play integrated into it. And I think that would be good for everyone, in my opinion. Not that I'm trying to, of course, tell people what they have to like. People can like anything. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say there's a little bit of a feeling right now that things are a little bit stagnant. Again, I hope it changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. An issue that I have with football, actually, at all levels, because I watch quite a bit of grassroots, I watch kids football, all the way up to academies and elite football. I think it's overcoached. So I watch grassroots and there could be 8-year-old kids and the coach is constantly shouting at them, just let them play, just let players play. And I worry at all ages, players aren't being allowed to play.
There's a photograph which I loved from a few years ago now, and I think it was Messi and Suarez were taking their kids to I don't know how old their kids were. They were pretty young, maybe 8, 9 or whatever, maybe younger. I don't know. They were at the side of a kid's game. Anyway, they were relaxed sitting in deck chairs. This is the thing, like, who knows more about football? Lionel Messi or, no disrespect, me, coaches, like any coach, right? For me, Lionel Messi knows more about football than any coach. So if he's pretty okay with just sitting there and letting these kids have fun and play, like, I think that's not a bad example to follow.
Mm.
And again, as we go through, we have to coach. I'm a coach. Of course, we're always having discussions, coaching players. Of course, you can say things during games. It's not that you can't say things, but maybe we should be encouraging. Maybe we should be, trying to give positive feedback. The main thing is, surely at these younger ages, that the kids enjoy football and that they leave training happy and they want to come back the next time and they feel good. Surely these are the most important things. Do you need to control everything during the game? Not really. I understand as a coach to give instructions, all the rest of it. But I mean, are the kids even understanding a lot of these instructions a lot of the time? I'm not trying to be some kind of like preachy guy because I'm, not really interested in that. But I'd be the same as you. I like, even at many levels, there's coach shouts from the side and I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, what are we talking about here? And it's not to say that I don't do it too. I'm not some kind of paragon of virtue here. I make mistakes. I say things that I think afterwards, what was I doing there? 100%. But yeah, I agree. Like, some of the overcoaching is, not always useful.
Yeah. I think you'll get some kids who never have played when they're not being coached. So they're never just players playing, having fun, being free. It's always coach-led, their whole experience of football.
Yeah, and again, we have to be careful about how we describe coaches. There are some fantastic youth coaches all over the world that are creating brilliant environments for young players to express themselves, to experiment, to feel confident in taking risks and playing the game in the way that they feel it. For sure, that is happening. And that is coaching also. It's not that coaching is bad, but I think there is definitely a style of coaching that can be dictatorial, that can be too authoritarian. I mentioned top down. It can be... And I think this comes from this, again, deeper, more philosophical point about having set ideas in your mind about what you're looking for when you go to coach a game. Isn't it nice to be surprised? I quote again Maric. I don't want to give this guy too much credit, right? But he talks about at Bayern, the coaches are most satisfied when the players do something that the coaches didn't expect in training. Mm. They know they're on the right track when that is happening. So let's enjoy the surprise like we do with film, in books, in stories, in life. Let's enjoy a little bit of mystery and surprise and not be so concerned and anxious and nervous when things deviate from the path that we have in our head. This comes back again to what we talked about chaos and order. Everything doesn't have to be so ordered. It's all okay, right? We can let it go. Maybe something that people might be interested in. There's a Chinese board game called Go. It's seen as vastly more complex than chess. Black and white markers on the board, and it's a strategy game. You move pieces around. Very, very complex game. And one of the very interesting things I read about the master Go players was an observation by someone who knows the game deeply. who said that every great Go player must go through a certain moment. And this is the moment when they become prepared, and this is his word, to let go of the base. And by that, I mean, let go of this assumption or this map you have in your head. Let it go. And the quote was, at first you feel fear, and then it becomes the thing that makes the team, that makes you great, right? It's like this ability to let go, I think, is very important for coaches. And you can see it during games, you can see it during trainings. It's not that you shouldn't plan. Again, it's not this black and white thing, but what is the manner in which you are planning? Are you building systems? We talked about growing systems that are primed. Their main aim is to achieve effective, functional, useful, spontaneous combinations and plays. Wouldn't that be an interesting way to approach system design, training design, day-to-day coaching, analysis, feedback, rather than going into a meeting with an under-11 team or player and you already know, this is what I want you to do today. Stand in the half space. You're going to receive the ball from here. It's different. So coaches can make their own minds up. The game will go in the way it goes. But I think appreciating that there is a fundamental difference between these approaches to coaching and the tactical theories and assumptions that are involved in them. Understanding these differences, for me, is very important. And I think if I was going to make a little bit of criticism of the general curriculum, coach education, tactical discussion, coaching theory, there isn't enough awareness about the possibilities that are outside of the current ways that we think.
Definitely. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you, Jerry. Thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, a real pleasure, Simon. Absolutely loved chatting. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. Where can people follow you and find out more about your work?
Yeah, you already mentioned the article. That's on my Medium account. I put most things through Twitter, now X. So you can just Jamie Hamilton. It's at @Sterling_J on Twitter. Articles on Medium. And I mentioned the Third Circle podcast. That's on Spotify, on Apple. And that's myself and one of the Spielverlagerung guys, Martin Raffelt, who actually worked as an analyst for Thomas Tuchel back in the day, back in the Mainz days of Tuchel's coaching career. So yeah, you can find me in those places.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Jamie.
Pleasure. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you for listening to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamworks Intelligence. We'll be back next month with another episode.